Hello, readers and writers. I am Anthony L. Manna, also known as Professor Grandpa Tonio, the book guy and the writing guy. Welcome to Writers on Writing, my podcast series of conversations with new and established authors. Today is International Day of Education, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Jessica Jones, an acclaimed educator who has taught in many schools and cultural venues. Jessica Jones is a visual artist, a published author of poetry and essays, and a highly regarded authority on Native American education and Native American literature. She has served as a teacher of grades 5 through 12 English, K through 12 art, and has taught on the Blackfeet Reservation with the Upward Bound program at the University of Montana, and also the Flathead Indian Reservation in Lake County, Montana. As a poet, she served as writer in residence for the Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio, where she taught poetry workshops to students who visited the park's Environmental Education Center. She was also employed as writer in residence with Calcutta Mercy Hospital in Kolkata, India, where she wrote about the needs of women, children, and orphans in the slums and the red light district to help raise funds for medical care and schooling. I think that's so amazing, by the way. As an educator, she is committed to helping students understand the suffering, resilience, and survival of Native peoples explored in Native American literature. And she does this by introducing teachers to sensitive approaches to reading and discussing Native American literature so as to avoid stereotypes. In 2019, Bitterroot, her debut book of poetry, was published as an award winner with Finishing Line Press in the New Women's Voices series. Bitterroot launched from the Wick Poetry Center in Ohio. And I'm happy to tell you that throughout our conversation, Jessica will read poems from Bitterroot. Currently, Jessica Jones is a faculty member at Kent State University on the Stark campus, where she engages her students in poetry, fiction, Native American literature, and writing courses that focus on diversity and social justice. Jessica, welcome. It's so good to have you here. I'm delighted to be talking with you today about your life as a writer. You know, I've been studying you, if you want to put it that way. So, yeah, you know, and so it's been such a pleasure. I mean, the diversity of what you've done in your career is startling, and so I'm so happy to meet you and to be talking to you today. So, I guess. I'd like to begin by asking you how, in a sense, how did this all happen? How did you become an advocate for, I should say, a passionate ally of Indian education?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I want to make sure I say that first because I'm as thrilled to be here with you as you sound to be with me. I sure enjoyed our phone conversation a month or so ago, and I just couldn't wait for today to continue that conversation. I know you've had a really diverse career yourself, so I just feel kind of honored to be here. Well, I guess first of all, I just love kids and always have. So even as a little girl, I knew I would want to be a teacher. I remember by about fourth grade, I already had it in my head that, you know, I wanted that desk with the apple on it and the windows behind me and books around me and kids in my life and so forth. But in addition to that, Indian education has in some way or shape or form always kind of woven through my life. In high school, my sister and I spent a little bit of time, a couple different summers on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. In college, it was always something that was kind of weaving through my studies and kind of on my radar. And I was always interested in diversifying the canon, since I'm a writer and a reader and a teacher. So I came to social justice education before I even knew what it was. You know, there wasn't really a name for it back when I was doing outreach at various schools and so forth. And it wasn't until I went to graduate school and there was finally a program that specialized in what I wanted. And I was like, yes, this is it. University of Montana has a program in Indian education. That's where I want to do my master's. And then from there, went straight to the res and got
That was,
teaching.
yeah,
So,
that's an arrival. I mean, in a way, it's an arrival, and it's just so wonderful to hear you talk like that, because I know I don't know, at an early age, I felt like, having grown up in a family where there was an immigrant, in a sense. My mother came from Italy, and I always thought, let's be accepting, and I didn't really know also what to call it, but
right.
it was, and when I got into graduate school as you, all of a sudden I thought, oh, so this is what it is, social acceptance and diversity, and it just opened up like a blossom, and
Yeah.
speaking of which, you trained in a program called Indian Education for All. Well, what is that all about, and who can join a program like that?
Sure. So I think I'm excited. I think we're going to start seeing more of this curriculum and push for this curriculum across the United States. But I can speak specifically for the program in Montana. It's called Montana Indian Education for All. And the state of Montana is one of the only states in the country to require a certain percentage of the curriculum in K through 12 schools to represent Native voices, Indigenous ways of knowing, I should say. IWOK is the acronym for Indigenous ways of knowing. And in Montana, it's 30%. So whether a teacher is teaching math, astronomy, reading, social studies, it's expected that within those school districts, 30% of that curriculum has to integrate and center on Indigenous ways of knowing. And so in graduate school, that was kind of part of the pedagogical training that I received. And then during summers, there were these wonderful month-long workshops put on by the National Writing Project, NWP. And there's most states have a state writing project. So this was the Montana Writing Project. And the sort of premise of National Writing Project is that if teachers of writing are immersed in writing themselves and are allowed to experience it as beginners, they can be better teachers of writing. And so the wonderful thing about going to grad school at University of Montana is that their summer month-long institute was immersive in Indian Education for All. So not only was I learning how to become a better teacher of writing and kind of being humbled on a daily basis, and, as an adult being forced to read my, nascent poetry out loud when it was still raw, all these things that we make students do. In addition to that, we had inquiry projects into things like the boarding school era, for example, or place names, or the tightly knit, I don't want to call it a boundary, kind of terrain between environmental education and Indian Education for All, and so forth. So one of those programs that I was involved in was that. The other was the graduate degree that I did. And then once I got into teaching on the res, most schools on reservation have certain Office of Public Instruction training days and so forth. So the school where I was called them tribal days. And in August every year, we were expected to attend anywhere from 3 to 4 days of training. And we'd be led by tribal elders. We'd learn, kind of hands-on projects we could do with the kids and so forth. But for other teachers who are interested in this, you don't necessarily have to live in Montana or live on the res. You can download materials from the Office of Public Instruction in Montana and in some other states. There are also materials available through the Smithsonian. You can go to the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian, and they have a wonderful program. Teachers can go over spring break or during summers. It's called, I think, 360 degrees. And it's kind of in collaboration with the museum itself. You can take workshops there, or I think during the pandemic, they have lots of Zoom types of things. Once you start digging around as an educator, you realize that I'm just talking about the tip of the iceberg. There's tons of materials out there. You just want to make sure that they are tribally approved.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's, wow. I have also been involved in Kent State University's the writing project from Berkeley. We called it now National Northern Ohio, Northeast Ohio Writing Project.
Okay.
And I wish I had known this, because we tried to diversify as much as we could, but now people are going to know this.
Yeah.
And I'm also going to alert the project, which I no longer work with, but I was co-directing it, that they can look for this and diversify in these ways. I mean, I think that diversity and social justice and social awareness is coming into its own in a way. I mean, I know it's always there, but I know what you mean, that we can pray for it, that as a possibility for all students, to know about human diversity. You obviously have committed yourself to engender interest in Native American literature. What can you tell us about that commitment?
Sure. Well, I'm very excited because right now I'm on full-time faculty at Kent State. This is my 6th year. And this semester, I'm actually getting to teach a whole semester of just Native literature to a class of upper division students. I'm just absolutely thrilled. But prior to that, no matter what I was teaching, I was always trying to draw in things from the voices that have been left out of American literature, whether that's African American literature, Asian literature, Native literature, whatever it is, trying to just kind of bring it in. And I think if I had any advice for other teachers out there, it would be to use some of their professional development to take these workshops, like I was just talking about, because no matter what field we're in, we can always widen our own perspective. And then there's this wonderful trickle down to our students. And I think that our own passion and excitement about being human and about having a fuller understanding of what it is to be human, it's contagious. And then our students get excited too. And if it's authentic and it's from the heart, and they see a mentor modeling humility, a mentor who's willing to say, I didn't know about this, I was wrong, or I'm still learning too, or wow, I'm surprised by this, or I don't know, but let's find out. Having that spirit of curiosity, I think that's where that engendering of interest in diversity begins.
Wonderful. Yes. Well, I mean, what you just said, I think should be written a little bit in gold, because I mean, the process you just talked about is wonderful for all education and all educators. I mean, it's engendering that curiosity, which is so precious for all of us. And now, so speaking of, how you brought literature in, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the Native books that you would recommend? Because I'm sure that there are folks who have little or even no knowledge of Native authors.
So on the screen here, I have a couple different slides that I'm going to just flash through. And as I talk about the slides, I can sort of read out a few of the titles for any listeners that would be interested. And the first genre that I have here on screen is further reading for those interested in poetry. So some of the seminal sort of seed poetry of Native writers. And I'll just go kind of title by title. I think I'll start in the lower right-hand corner with Joy Harjo. She is actually our poet laureate right now. I think she's in her 2nd or 3rd term. She's our first Native poet laureate. She's a strong female. She's just absolutely a powerhouse. And I'm thrilled to say that she's going to be our guest for the Big Read at Kent State campus on March 17th. St. Patrick's Day. She will be at the Wick Poetry Center. So anyone in Northeast Ohio who would like to hear her read, Joy Harjo is wonderful. This is her books, She Had Some Horses. The Big Read on campus is American Sunrise. I would recommend her memoir, Crazy Brave, which I think I have on another slide. Another author to look up is N. Scott Momaday. Oh, and I should say Joy Harjo is Muskogee Creek. N. Scott Momaday is an author from Kiowa country. This is a kind of a lyric memoir. It's a combination of poetry and a little bit of storytelling. On the left, we have Sand Creek by Simon Ortiz, kind of a historical poetry document. It's jarring, but for those interested in history, that's a good one. On the upper left, we have Lucy Tapahanso. She's my personal favorite. She's a Diné author from Navajo country. The title of this one is The Women Are Singing. She has a couple different titles. And I just love her work because it's so place-based. She does incorporate some of her native language. The imagery is really rich. She really just takes you places with her. Top and center is Jimmy Santiago Baca, Black Mesa Poems. He's a storyteller, but he tells his stories through poetry, almost like snapshots on the cover of the book. And then another favorite up here in the upper right, James Welch, Montana native author. This is Riding the Earth Boy 40. He's also a novelist. So if you look up James Welch, you're going to find a host of various titles. The next screen, further reading fiction. Here we got James Welch again, Fool's Crow, a historical novel. Sweetgrass Basket, which the lower left right here, this is not a native author, and it's very rare that I would recommend something not written by a native author. However, part of her family, I think her husband's family was native, and she did a ton of historical research into the boarding school era. And so it's a really heartfelt lyric young adult novel written about that experience. And I think it's based on the journals of her husband's aunt. I think I'm getting that correctly. I'd have to look at it again, but it is legit. And I have seen it listed on native websites as a good read. Of course, Sherman Alexie, he's sort of like the groundbreaking native young adult writer. This is called The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Some listeners might know that he's had some controversial issues in the news about harassment of women and so forth. I'm always really frank with my students and let them know that many, many authors in our canon from many, many different backgrounds have been called out for their behavior. I will say that Sherman Alexie has come forward and he's been very forthright about his own recovery and so forth. He's a wonderful, brilliant writer, so I would still include him despite that. They're there. This is a more contemporary writer, Tommy Orange, more about the young urban Indian experience. Upper right, we've got Louise Erdrich. This is a wonderful novel called Love Medicine. There's just nugget after nugget of wisdom in that story. And front and center, groundbreaking, absolutely earth-shattering ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. Kind of a thick read, but very important if you're interested in the genre of Native Lit. The next screen here, this is Philosophy and Indigenous Ways of Knowing. I only have 4 titles here because I'm really more of a literature teacher, but Indigenous Ways of Knowing are inseparable from Native Lit, so it's important to at least read something. Upper left, we've got Vine Deloria with God is Red, a Native View of Religion. Upper right, we've got Power and Place in Indian Education in America by Vine Deloria and Daniel Wildcat. They're 2 of my favorites. I really, really enjoy the way they conversationalize in their writing. Every Day is a Good Day, Wilma Mankiller. And this is actually an edited collection with lots of different women in there from various backgrounds, not all writers necessarily. So like there are some painters in there, some leaders and so forth. Really a great read for young women, I think. And then on the lower right, we've got Linda Hogan with Dwellings, a spiritual history of the living world. And then for those who teach children, some resources for responsible reading, a website you might look up right here. It's spelled OYATE, and I believe it's just oyate.org. And they have list after list of resources that have been tribally approved, looked at by elders and so forth. And they also have advice on books to avoid. And then same thing down here, ancestor approved intertribal stories for kids, kind of a little link to the HarperCollins website with a collection here. So I'll come out of screen share and come back to you, Anthony. I know that's a lot of information.
Oh, that was terrific. Thank you very much. There's a rainbow there, you know, and yes, and I've seen too that for children and young adult literature, which I spend a lot of time with, even in my retirement, that I'm so happy to see HarperCollins set up their Native American trade, and it's so good to see it. And I've discovered Cynthia Leitich. Is that the way? Cynthia Leitich Smith.
I think so.
She does a lot of YA, and it's good stuff. I'm just so happy because it's true. I would have to say I knew very little, and everything is a gem because I'm learning so much from these writers, Now I turned to your resume and I was struck by the wealth of experience you've had teaching Native literature. I'm just wondering about your guide. Our listeners and viewers would benefit from your guidance for reading and exploring Native literature with, say, children and teens. I know you teach at the university level too, so go ahead, wherever you want to go. But
Sure.
What do you recommend,
Yep, I actually, I'm going to do another screen share here because I have a kind of a guideline that I share with when I do workshops for teaching teachers. So if we have a few minutes, I'd like to just kind of walk through this, if that's all right with you, Anthony.
Sure.
Can you see it okay?
Yes, sure.
Okay, great.
I can see it. Yes, I can see it. It's very vivid.
Okay. So this is a handout. I give at workshops. I give it in my college classes with my students. Sometimes when I teach Summer Upward Bound, I'll give it out to my high school kids, even though they themselves live on a reservation, they're from the res. Sometimes, it's important that we just open the dialogue. It's almost like the inclusion of land acknowledgements these days, which are really, really important, but they're just a doorway. So I kind of use this list of guidelines as a doorway. The first point that I like to talk about is that we have to realize Indigenous cultures are land-based. So nature, place, religion, and language are often inseparable. Indigenous languages often contain wisdoms that people who come in from the outside and don't speak that language as a first language are not going to understand because they are tied to places or they are tied to things that happened in certain locations, or there's references to nature that are very, very specific to culture and so forth. So we have to realize that these cultures are land-based and that many of these groups have been forced out of their homelands, which continues to cause loss in every aspect of life. When we read Indigenous literature, we're going to see evidence of this here and there. And if we don't understand this point, that might be lost on us. The next point is to accept that many Indigenous cultures are primarily oral, meaning that stories, verse, song, wisdom, ways of knowing are passed from one generation to the next, not necessarily with a written component. Some do, some have not, some have come to this later, but because of the complicated nature of colonialism, there can be a deep distrust of the written word. And sometimes that comes into play within literature itself. And there might be deep, deep ironies of the written word. We also have to be aware that commonly accepted standards of European and Caucasian American canons might not apply. So it's important that we conduct research to explore the expectations and the aesthetics within the given tribe or the region that we're studying. So for example, if we were to go in and look at early Native songs, their standards of beauty are conciseness, short line length, repetition, nature imagery, such as water or the wind or birds, things like this. And there's an implication that the audience hearing the song is a part of that cultural group and that they will understand what's being said. If we were to take, let's say, an Ojibwe song from around the year 1500 and place it next to a Shakespearean sonnet or Elizabethan English, folks in Elizabethan England are not going to think that this beautiful Ojibwe love song or song about nature is up to par, right? Because it's not written in like rhyming couplets, it's not iambic pentameter, it doesn't have this complex psychological, depth to it, this whole sort of Shakespearean element. And likewise, probably the Ojibwe audience is going to think, this is bizarre. This Shakespeare dude is off his rocker, So we have to really kind of immerse ourselves in the expectations and the aesthetics of the tribe, of the time period, of the literature that we're studying. Otherwise, we might think that something is unappealing without realizing that it's actually quite appealing or masterful in the culture that we're looking at. The next bullet point is to avoid sweeping generalizations. No one author in any tradition from any race, class, gender, age, culture can be expected to represent his, her, or their culture, their race, their religion, their gender perspective, etc. We always want to avoid those generalizations and acknowledge that I cannot represent every, middle-aged female from Northeast Ohio. We're going to be diverse within any group. So along with that, we want to be tribally specific. North America alone, that's not even looking at South America or Australia or New Zealand, has hundreds of diverse, highly unique indigenous tribes with distinct languages, distinct religion, and culture that are very much alive today. It's not a thing of the past. So we want to be respectful of these differences and not speak of Indigenous life as something that's over. We don't want to assume that the cowboys and Indians time period is something that happened in the past and it's done. Next bullet point, we want to understand that much Indigenous culture has been erased, has been oppressed, illegalized up until the 1970s. Native religions across the US were not legal. There've been lots of issues with the ability of families to legally keep their children. There's just layer after layer of difficulty when it comes to laws and Native life in the US. Indigenous culture has been marginalized, stereotyped, appropriated, stolen, tokenized, romanticized, mysticized throughout history. And these erasures permeate American understandings of, quote, the Indian. And then they therefore manifest in books, in film, in fashion, sports, psychology, New Age spiritual movements, and even in academic conversation. So we need to always kind of be alert to those and be willing to open it up a little bit, unpack it, talk to each other, try to take it apart and have a multi-story narrative to overcome these stereotypes. This one's important when it comes to buying literature for classrooms, especially, or for the young people in our lives. We want to avoid buying literature that's written from the first person perspective of non-Indigenous authors imagining to be or recounting fictional accounts as though they themselves are Native American. Instead, we want to turn to those websites that I just offered to kind of help screen out those non-legitimate texts. If possible, we always want to have, if we're doing a first-person narrative, we want to have that narrative told from the lens of someone who has walked in those shoes. Now, that's not to extricate or to ostracize witness literature. That's different. We can still incorporate witness literature into the braid of what we read, but we want to acknowledge that it is something different. It's from another perspective. This is something more for probably college kids and adult writers, but it's important to familiarize ourselves with the basic outline of federal policies looking back over the last 500 years. And this goes back to what I mentioned early on. These can be found through the OPI, the Office of Public Instruction. Montana offers these, and they're called the Essential Understandings Regarding Montana Indians. And there's wonderful printable documents. They're easy to hold, they're easy to flip through, they're very simple if you just kind of read the bullet points. And it helps us understand what has happened from 1491 until now, and the federal policies that have kind of guided and formed how we have ended up where we are today. And then the last two, we want to be prepared for Indigenous perspectives in literature to contrast sometimes. And sometimes that contrast is sharply, in sharp contrast with each other, or in sharp contrast with perspectives commonly told by the mainstream. Therefore, we want to always embrace the wideness of Indigenous literature and its many, many subgenres. The PowerPoint slides I showed a few moments ago, those are just a few of the genres. I mean, I just covered some philosophy, fiction, and poetry, but there's much beyond that. There's sci-fi, there's thriller, there's detective novels, and so on and so forth. So there are always young voices continuing to contribute fresh perspectives, and there are older voices that are continuing to gain presence because they're being kind of discovered or rediscovered within our ever-widening American canon.
Wonderful. So, very illuminating. Thank you so much. I mean, again, it's like, in a sense, it's almost humbling. And I like that. I like that because it means that I'm on the verge of knowing, learning, and I think it's just incredibly rich. I'm so glad that you're talking to us. I read a statement you made about your commitment, and this is the quote, to help students understand the depth of understanding and survivance often present in Native literature. So what do you do to encourage students to take heart to the injustices and indignities Indigenous people have endured in the past? And I think the thing that I like very much about what you're talking about is that it's not only the past. We get that impression that it's a cowboy and Indian movie, and it happened in the West, and it's all over,
Right.
So what do you do?
Right. There's a really good book out there called Rethinking Columbus for teachers. It's put out by an organization called Rethinking Schools. They're in, I think, Minnesota. And they offer some pretty cool exercises in there to do with classes or the kids in your life to think about or to experience sort of micro versions of injustice, and therefore think about empathy. What's it like when someone walks up to my desk and just kind of digs through my purse and says, "This is mine," and walks away? We can give these kind of scenarios to help kids think, well, they can't do that. That's my purse. But this is what happens when land bases are stolen from conquerors worldwide, not just in the US. Someone kind of can come up and say, well, this is my purse now. This is my land now. I'm in charge. I get the contents of this. So I always try to look for organizations that offer books I can read that have ready to go lesson plans, empathy, exercises in empathy and things like that. And I think the act of reading itself engenders empathy. I know there are studies out there that talk about compassion and how reading about fictional characters allows young children to kind of walk in somebody else's shoes and expands the mind to consider what other experiences are like. I think some of those things.
Absolutely. And again, it's the awakening, it's an illumination all over the place. Now I'd like you to read one of your poems. And so I said, boarding schools, which I love, or marginalia, which are reflecting some of the things you've been talking about.
Yeah, I thought about this and I decided for this morning that I think I'll read Boarding Schools because we've been kind of touching on some of the historical moments, but not really diving into them. And I think this poem, for readers who are open to it, allows some of that empathy to grow. And it also hits on this term of survivance, which is a term coined by Gerald Visner, an Anishinaabe author. And I love this term because it doesn't really pin it down. It forces those of us thinking about this term to kind of dance around it. The idea that survivance isn't survival, it's also not celebration. It's just this kind of mix of like resilience and having come through suffering and we're still here. So I don't mention that term in here, but the fact that the poem contains the history of boarding schools as well as some of the survivors of boarding schools points to that. This is called Boarding Schools. At the Indian Ed Conference, Crow Agency, the gallery is lined with photos. Sioux, Cheyenne, Pawnee children as young as 5 years old, forced to leave their families, not given back until 18, taught American skills, industrial arts useless on the plains. Inuit children hauled to Pennsylvania, Navajo, Little Shell, Blackfeet forced to strip their clothes, erase their names, learn the same foreign tongue. I can't stop staring at one photo, titled Boys and Girls in Back of Mission Truck, 1928, Children Coming from Cut Bank Boarding School. 24 kids crowded in coats, hats, their faces achingly familiar. They could be Noah, Anicia, Camii, Cree, big eyes, soft cheeks, the same dimpled fingers that trace the desks in my room each morning. It was not until 1978, the presenter's voice floats between didactics, that Native American parents gained the right to deny their children's placement in off-reservation schools. A man behind me is telling a woman they cut off his braids, beat his knuckles, how he carried a sliver of soap in his pocket, forced to eat it when he slipped into crow, that everyone, even his friends, said, "Don't speak, don't speak, don't speak."
Wow. God, it's so moving. Whew. You know, I mean, I read that, but then to have you read it to me, it takes on a whole different aura, you know, and the survivance,
yeah,
you know, and the suffering and the you know, you just sometimes can't believe what we do to one another.
It's true, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you I think you meant you addressed this next one, and so if you want to skip over it, I can understand. But I asked you here that in what ways will students or anyone's understanding of aspects of Native American history make them sensitive readers of Native American literature? And I thought you went through that with your list there, but you may want to, you know, mention a few things here.
I feel like I covered it, but you know, there's one little anecdote that I would like to share with you because I think you'll relate to this, having been a literature professor yourself. I was at an English club meeting a couple of years ago, and this wonderful colleague of mine who taught African American literature did an exercise with us. It was, you know, a couple of faculty members, the students, and she's sitting there and she holds up, she was going to do a talk on African American lit. She holds up a book and she says, it was Harry Potter. She says, "What genre is this?" And we all say, "Oh, young adult lit." She holds up Louisa May Alcott. "What genre is this?" And Emily Dickinson. And we all said, "Oh, women's lit." She holds up Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison. And we say African American lit. And she holds up Walt Whitman and says, "What genre is this?" And we all go, "It's just American literature." Right. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks, how important it is that we get the frameworks we need for the literatures that have been marginalized, because we can't just walk into Holocaust lit and not teach ourselves and our kids about Kristallnacht or the ghetto or the Gestapo or whatever. Like we need those frameworks, and we need those frameworks for Native lit as well.
Wow. Yeah, you know, we're in a real controversy about this in the States right now, with so many politicians talking to us that they don't want us to teach the survivance. They don't want us to teach the struggle, the suffering, you know, because we'll feel guilty, and it's pretty amazing. I think that we're in that paradigm that needs to shift. Or I think people like you or me or other literature teachers can rise up and say, no, that's not the way it works. It sensitizes,
Yep.
you know, so.
And guilt doesn't serve us.
No.
It's moving through that, moving towards action that
Right.
gets
And I mean, if they read enough, some of these politicians would read enough, they would see that it's an opening to human understanding and human sensitivity, you know.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's a movement. What is the movement called? I'm slipping past that. That, you know, it'll come back to me, but I mean, it's definitely an expression that people are using to avoid cultures. You know?
I'm not sure. There's so many terms flying around out there. My students are always teaching me new things that I haven't caught.
So when you talk about, and I think also you've mentioned this a little bit, but when you think about Native American stereotypes, which ones do you think we need to challenge and also obliterate, avoid, whatever?
Mm-hmm. I think it's so important that we talk about mascots. Mascots are a problem. They're so dehumanizing. Studies show that they're terrible for self-esteem, for Native kids that are in schools that still use Native mascots. The more students are exposed to things like that, the less sense of community there is in a school or in a neighborhood or whatever. So I think it's important to look at mascots. I think it's important to not put any culture on a pedestal. Oftentimes there is this mysticization, when I lived out west, my former partner and I did foster care and had Native kids, and he himself is Indigenous and so forth. And oftentimes if I was maybe back home or I was traveling and that would come up in conversation, people would say to me, "That's so cool." And I'd look at them like, these are my loved ones. I don't think you realize what it feels like to be seen as though you're in like a glass cage, an exotic zoo animal. And that's what that does. It dehumanizes. So I think that if we can continue to open these dialogues about things like mysticizing cultures, putting mascots on cultures and so forth, then we can dismantle them. There's a wonderful, this is the last thing I'll say on this question, but there's a wonderful TED Talk by an African woman. She's from Nigeria. Her name is Chimamanda Adichie. She's a novelist, and it's called The Danger of the Single Story Narrative. And in this TED Talk, she kind of unpacks this notion that if we only tell one story about a culture, we are flattening it out for all of us, and we're losing out on a celebration of the human spirit. And I won't tell all her stories because they're hers, but what she realized was that as a Nigerian woman, she was practicing stereotypes within the sort of the class levels in her culture. And then when she came to America to be a student, her roommates were stereotyping her based on what they thought it was to be African. And at the time, there was not literature written from Nigeria that represented who she was, growing up as a little girl. All the literature she read was about blue-eyed girls with blonde hair, in England, eating apples and drinking tea and so forth. And she says that we've got to have multiple story narratives. This is how we're going to overcome stereotypes, because stereotypes endanger us all.
Yeah, and I think Haaland, the new, she's in government.
Yep.
To protect, she's also talking about mascots, but she's also talking about some of the language, some of the squaw language, and and how it's demeaning in so many ways. And I mean, she's outspoken, which I think is what we need to hear. We have a commonality here. I mentioned that here you are teaching on the Flathead Reservation, and I was once invited to teach a children's literature course of all things to teachers and the support staff on a Passamaquoddy reservation in northern Maine. And, I worried about it. I'm a non-native. Would I be accepted? Would I be welcomed? And I say to you here, yes, I was warmly welcomed. So what about your experiences as a non-native on the res?
Yeah. I have always had such positive experiences. And I realize part of that is probably invisible privilege that I don't realize. I think that oftentimes female teachers are welcomed in a little bit more because we're seen as being nurturing and so forth. I was young when I first started, and so I think that probably also helped. But, I think that approaching things humbly helps as well. And I knew that I was, we're all on native land, no matter where we are, but I was on native land that had been kept as native land and so forth. And so I really kind of came in with my heart open because I wanted to work with kids. And in a couple of the communities that I worked in, they're small towns. Montana at the time is getting more populated, but it's still sparsely populated. And one of the towns had like 1,200 people in it. And so there's this funny story I always like to tell. I had just been hired as a 6th grade teacher, and I did not know this yet, but my picture was in the newspaper with my name under it. This is our new sixth grade teacher and so on. So for like a week, I'm going to the grocery store, the gas station, whatever. People are waving at me. People are saying, "Hi, Miss Jones," and it took me forever to figure out like, oh, like this is small town rural America. They're going to know who I am. There was no privacy, but I loved it. And I think in towns like that, whether it's a reservation or not, the school is kind of the centerpiece of town. And so I'd have my 7:30 in the morning arrival at school. I'd get done with doing after school detention or whatever at 4:30. But then in the gym, there's an auction or a basketball game or the girls volleyball team or a powwow or a community dinner. So I'd be at school all day because there's stuff going on and you get to know people that way. I mean, I remember coming home to Ohio for Christmas one year. My mom and I were in a grocery store. And I looked at her and I said, "This is so weird. I'm in a grocery store. There's got to be 100 people in here and I don't know a single one of them."
Right.
Yeah. So I felt warmly welcomed,
Yeah, and I when I was reading about you and being on the reservation, I remember the sincere. I mean, people were reaching out to me,
Yes.
and I just felt so honored, and then there were some of the older women, and I don't want to romanticize this, by the way, but some of the older women were basket weaving.
Yeah.
And they were sitting there listening to me, and I was watching them and just so appreciative that they were bringing part of their culture to me,
Yep.
And the snacks as well, et cetera, on we go. Your poem, Valentine's Day or North Star, let us go forth again. And this is beautiful stuff. And so which one you decide.
Yeah, I thought that I would do Valentine's Day because it does really speak to the wonderful sense of interconnection that I felt being a sixth grade teacher. And this is on the Flathead Reservation. So Valentine's dance, and we're coming up on February, so I guess this is timely. Such a flurry, the day of a dance. Snow is still blue, dark out my window when they trickle in. Who's going? And what are you wearing, Miss Jones? That skirt? I like its roses. Bridger eyeing my ankles as I hang his pink paper chain above our door. By noon, my desk overflows. Carnations, cupcakes, caramels, and a heart-shaped tin. Lunch apples, even a lemon from someone's kitchen. The empty-handed lure cookies from dark pockets give me eraserless pencils. When the bell rings, we race home. By 7, return to fill a darkened gym. Billy Joe paces in black shirt, red tie. Girls float by in white dresses. The shy ones huddle, beginning unfinished sentences while their eyes dart about. We teachers are shocked. A $3 ticket and Friday night ride? Too much for most. But here they are, busting the disco, the windshield wiper, the swim, and some other move I can only call the flop. In a dark corner, even my quietest boy, giving it up to the arms flying head down all out cross-country ski.
Connection, please. You started off by saying the interconnection or something. You used an expression, interrelatedness. And I mean, how beautiful for you to see, for those images, for you to mine those images, and present them to us. Your role, many roles as a teacher, you once taught visual arts.
Mm-hmm.
And, I should point out that you are a professional artist. You've exhibited, and our listeners will find an exhibit of some of your art on your website. Mm-hmm. And I like how you set that up. I was intrigued. When teaching art to young students, what do you do or what do you hope they'll learn when you engage them in art activities? And I just happened to mention one, which is intriguing to me, which is the flying creature lesson.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
the photographs, our viewers and listeners should know that if they're going to see lots of photographs of you working with kids, and that's very endearing, but also very uplifting. So what about the flying creature lesson, or whatever lesson you want to choose?
Sure. Yeah. I love teaching art, and I always feel lucky during summers if I get assigned to teach art history to my upward bound kids, because then I get to do hands-on things to go with it and so forth. The flying creature was a lot of fun. That was a summer in Missoula, with Missoula Public Schools, just kind of a summer camp thing. And I was trying to think of a way to help the kids think outside the box, because and I had to do a 3D assignment, and oftentimes these were third graders, fourth graders, by the time they reach third and fourth grade, they're already starting to learn what the rules are, where reality starts and the imagination stops and so forth. And so I decided to have them make paper mache animals of some sort, but no matter what animal they chose, it had to have wings. And if they didn't want to use an animal that already existed, they could make one up. And we had feathers and colored tissue paper and glitter. And I mean, I'm sure the janitor just hated my classroom at the end of the day. But I think that my goal in any classroom, not just visual art, is to hopefully help students feel like they're safe enough to make mistakes, that they can explore things and break rules so that they better understand what the rules are and why they're there, or why maybe they shouldn't be there, and to get into that zone, to realize that there's something kind of larger than ourselves when it comes to creativity. And if we just open ourselves to that channel, it's going to flow through us. Clay and paint and all these wonderful things allow students to get into that mode of creating.
Beautiful. Yeah. And then the permission, in a sense. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but I mean, sometimes I think they feel that they're being allowed or permitted. And it's what an opening that is. Another of your poems, Field Trip.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Field Trip. Let's see. I didn't mark that page, so give me just a moment.
It's on page 7.
Oh, good. You did do your homework. Oh, this was a fun day. It's always fun for me to read these because it kind of brings me back to the moment. And the students and I had done a little project. They weren't flying creatures, but we did fish mobiles that were part of this unit on looking at species in Montana. So this is called Field Trip. The 6th graders tried to fish Kicking Horse, which is a reservoir. While grown-ups assembled rods, doled out line, hooked worms, kids were each to cast twice. But Will dropped his meds in the gravel. Cheyenne lost her glasses. Everyone wanted sunscreen. Jaslyn slipped in the mud. The outhouse was a hike. When the buses rolled in too soon, Mr. Valor got so mad the students were scared to board. Returned to the shade of my classroom with chairs stacked and 20 minutes to kill, we hung our trout mobiles from the ceiling, then played a game of metaphors. Just as the bell rang, Elijah shouted, "Miss Jones has more curves than a racetrack," and darted, leaving me in sudden quiet under a school of paper fish, their colored fins gently swimming in and out, so very soundless.
Oh, gosh. Hold on to that image. Will keep you sustained for a long time. Because what they leave behind sometimes is so much more important than what we went through, because it's the wonderful memory. I'd like to turn to the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which is so close to my residence here and your residency there. And I say, a valuable strategy for inspiring young writers, but you have so much. So, whatever you want to choose from there, I think is, and then that I think it will be worthwhile to all of us. And then I asked you to read a few of the poems your young residency writers wrote.
Yeah. So in 2007 to 8, for a full 12 months, I got to live in the Cuyahoga Valley and live in one of the park properties and kind of hike around with elementary and middle school kids that came through to camp for 3 or 4 days. They would live in not camp, they would be in the dormitories, and they would attend a nature camp at the environmental center. And so it was my job to tromp through the woods with them and write poetry. And what was wonderful about this was that the woods themselves were the classroom. And so all I really had to do was get the kids to tune into their 5 senses. And that's still kind of a tactic I take even with my college students. We'll go out, we'll write haikus, we'll, listen, we'll kind of go through each of the senses. And I ended up eventually writing an essay about that experience of spending a year in the woods with kids. And it's called Press Your Ear to the Whispering Branch, Deep Listening in the English Classroom. It's published in JAPL for any teachers or scholars out there who might want to look it up. But this is an excerpt from that essay that contains bits of the children's poetry. So I'm just going to read a little tidbit here. And before I read it, I should say, I broke the essay into 5 parts. The idea that when we spend time in nature and do deep listening with children, and even as adults, several things occur. We're able to access stillness. We can have greater self-knowledge. We experience a sense of wonder of the nature around us. We can access playfulness and humor. And we also have a greater awareness of our interconnection with each other and with the natural world. So this is in the section of the essay called Awareness of Interconnection. One day, after a particularly successful workshop, I was tramping through the woods and fell in behind 3 boys. They were discussing the poetry they had just written. No, man, that one wasn't mine. Mine was the flower, I heard one of them say. Who wrote about the wind? I don't know, she didn't say. Mine was the button. The bachelor button? Yeah. Read it again, man, I didn't hear it. The boy unrolled the paper in his fist and read as he scuffed through the leaves. Bachelor buttons are beautiful, I think you would agree, the puddles of their centers staring up at me. The middle of this flower looks like a cat's claw, open and pointed inward like a shark's jaw. That's sweet, man, that's tight. And then they kind of continue tromping through the woods. So I think for any teacher of writing, whether it's with kids or with college kids, getting them to just listen to the world and use their 5 senses, things are going to happen.
Well, that essay, which I read, of course, is again, it's a methodology, in a sense. I mean, for a new teacher, a veteran teacher, to reawaken to the possibility of what you can lead kids to when you guide them in any environment, really. But I mean, particularly in nature. That's so wonderful to hear. And then now we turn to you as the professor.
Yeah.
Here you are at Kent State University, and I'm assuming that a full semester of creative writing, lessons, projects, etc. As their writing coach, and I love the concept underpinning that word. What are some activities and skills you have them engage in to make them better writers?
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite lessons that I had as an undergrad student in art was in a ceramics class where the professor had us throw about 50 clay pots on the potter's wheel and then smash them all. And what that taught me at the age of like 19 is not to be so precious about my creations, because he made us smash every single pot. And there were some I really liked, So I tell my creative writing students that, and then we do an exercise where they bring printouts of their poems and they have to chop them up and throw all their pieces of their poems into a little pile on their desks, and they can trade pieces with each other. They can tape them down. They can take Sharpie markers and black things out. And they have to, at the end of class, have recreated at least 2 or 3 poems out of whatever it was they actually brought in with them. It's so fun. And they always end up saying it's one of their favorites, their favorite workshops at the end of the semester. And then we hang everything on the blackboard and walk around and look at them.
Yeah. And that business of walking around, you're reminding me of the writing project, because there's that one skill where you paste everything up. I mean, you post everything, and then we walk around, talking to ourselves and to each other about what we're exploring. But there's got to be something there, and that's what's so beautiful about this activity. I think there are a lot of teachers who are listening to this and watching this, who will appreciate doing that activity because it's very
fun.
doable, and it's fun. It's very doable.
Yeah.
All right. So, my dear, in closing,
Yes.
may I ask you what inspires you to write, to teach, to make art?
Yeah. Life is hard, and I often think that as beautiful as this planet is, there's also a lot of suffering here. And it's whatever we're doing here while we're on this planet, we're learning lots of lessons. And for me, poetry and art have always been a way to make sense of things, to find meaning, to connect with others across time, to help me navigate my way. Even as a teenager, I remember reading Virginia Woolf and just feeling like, oh, someone understands me, or I loved Emily Dickinson as a 15-year-old. And now, I'll discover new authors. I've been into a lot of European poetry lately, and some poetry from like the Gaza Strip, and, this kind of conflict between Palestine and Israel and blah, blah. And I'm reading this, and it helps me to talk, if you will, to other writers and artists throughout the history of humanity, because it makes me feel less alone.
That's beautiful.
And I hope that, like, through teaching and through whatever little bits of art and writing I can create, that maybe I help someone else.
Yeah, that's a good way to put that. I mean, because you're communicating yourself. I think also one of the things that I keep finding that I get inspired as a writer is the fact I've become inspired as a writer because there's also craft. I mean, just by reading, I'm working on fantasy now, and I'm just reading other fantasists, and to see how they create that other world without bumbling through it, is very encouraging. And yeah, so I do believe that we do become enlightened by other writers, and our lives are enriched in such a way that, and I like the way you said it, I feel less alone. It's true, because we can sometimes, even in the midst of being with a partner, being around other people, being around our students, sometimes we feel very isolated. And so it's nice. We need to, we need to awaken ourselves to good literature. Can the one we're working on to write, and also what we're reading. Your poem, to end with your poem, Dear Vaccine, is obviously timely.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I am so honored. To be here today. Obviously, I'm just absolutely thrilled. So thank you for having me. And I'm also honored to have this poem. It's part of a project with the Wick Poetry Center. There's some wonderful people up there doing extremely good work in the world at Wick. And they're publishing a book coming out this winter, I think this winter, late this spring, that is responses by poets around the world thinking about the pandemic. And I'm just really excited to be a part of that collection. So this has not hit print yet, but it will be coming out later this year. Dear Vaccine. Dear Vaccine, give back the wobbly table at the front of my physical classroom, where students and I broke bread, read a braided essay as snow fell out our window. Let elders more time to speak in Dine and Micmac and Haida, voices not muted by hospital glass, but heard laughing shoulder to shoulder. Grant us the perfume of a crowded opera, the useful liberty of shared work, the sacred plume of chalk dust, sawdust, pollen, dandelion butter on our naked noses. Allow us one more view from a 747, cheek pressed to glass to see the Rockies beneath a sherbet strata of pink. And my second-hand quilted purse? I'd like to carry its bright paisley back out into the world, dive deep into its pockets for a shining dime when a stranger can't find their own. Let us, O Vaccine, share life's brief and brimming cup, passed hand to hand to hand.
Yeah. What we've lost, but there's hope, isn't there? Those last lines, there will be, from the wobbly desk to the promise, and we're all praying for it. So folks, for more information about Jessica's career, her outreach, and her projects, her website, and I think I'll ask to have this posted, because it's a little complicated, but it's naea.digication.com/Jessica_Jones/welcome. I love that. On her website, she welcomes visitors into her studio where they find examples of her artwork and her exhibitions. Visitors can also see endearing photos of her students and other participants in various schools and programs and at her residencies. Also, note the link there to the collection of poetry from which she just read. Her students wrote during her residency at the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, www.dayinthewoods.blogspot.com. You'll soon find a recording of our interview in the media section of my website, anthonymanabooks.com, at Writers on Writing, Podbean, Podcast. A link will also be available in the video, to a video in our conversation in youtube.com. Jessica, thank you so much. You're spending precious time with me and our listeners, because I know you're in a semester right now and you've got a lot on your mind. Our listeners and viewers, it's been a great pleasure to hear you, not to only talk about your experiences, but also your outreach. That's the big thing for me, is how you take that sense of diversity and social justice and just bring it out, all over the place. And I just think that people will want to know more about you. And also your book of poetry, which is available at Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and directly from Finishing, there we go, Bitterroot, finishinglinepress.com. Thank you so much. And it's been a total pleasure. And I hope we stay in touch.
Me too. I was just going to say, I think we should have coffee or another Zoom or phone call sometime.
Yeah, let's
I'd love that.
I would love it too. And so I wish you so much luck in this semester. Having gone through that so many years of my life, I understand how a little jittery we are at the beginning, but then it all comes together so beautifully. So do take care of yourself, be safe, and be happy. Thank you so much, Jessica.
So much. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.